All right. Hello, everybody. I am here with Luise Loges, a PhD researcher at the University of Glasgow, who specifically researches the illicit trade in antiquities. And we're going to be discussing the recent heist at the British Museum and kind of a more archaeological approach to it rather than just like, this is the news, if you see what I mean. And so I guess my first question for you, Luise, is that sounds like an exciting job to research the antiquities trade. And are you a spy?
I unfortunately I'm not a spy, but then that's what a spy would say. So, but I'm not a
Oh,
spy. So, yeah, no, it is absolutely fascinating. Well, I started off doing my master's in cuneiform studies, or Assyriology, as however you want to call it, and with minors both in Egyptology and Near Eastern archaeology in Germany. And then I kind of went away from that to do science journalism with archaeological topics for about 5 years. For once, because the countries I specialized in, the country I specialized in had just started a civil war, which was impractical, and also, yeah, because I like writing and I thought journalism was a good idea. So I got into the whole antiquities theft, antiquities looting that happened there, and yeah, especially in Syria, and with the whole media attention on also ISIS and so on. So I started to get in there, and then at some point I met up with Donna Yates then in Glasgow, and we had a coffee, and then I decided to do a PhD with her. And so that's what I'm doing.
so long story short, you're a spy that works for Interpol. And no. But yeah, so I think it's a really important topic. I mean, for my own self, I don't work in any countries that have any conflict going on, but I have worked in places where there's active looting. I've had sites that I've been working on to map or excavate where looters would come in at night. In one case, I was doing mapping on this project in the Crimean Peninsula. This was 20 years ago, before any conflict or anything like that. And overnight, someone had dug up our datum. So a datum is a fixed point where we set up our mapping equipment, and we had it set in a piece of concrete, a nail, and somebody overnight had just dug it up. And so we had to waste a whole day. They thought treasure was under it. There wasn't any treasure under it, but we had to
But
waste the whole day setting up a new datum, of course. Yeah.
that's one of the things that I'm also looking into, the public perception of looting. The public perception of looting is always kind of tied to conflict or civil war, civil unrest, that kind of thing. But it happens all the time,
Oh,
and it
yeah.
happens everywhere. It
Yeah.
happens. It still happens in rich countries, but it obviously happens far more often and far more severely in poorer countries. And in the end, all the stuff goes to rich countries. Yeah,
I
and
agree.
it's not just conflict, but the public perception often just sees it with conflict.
Yeah. And so on that note, while this is not in a conflict setting, I think this heist at the British Museum is a good sort of excuse, if you will, to jump into these kind of topics. So just to bring everybody up to speed, a few days ago, the British Museum announced that it was reporting the missing, stolen, and damaged items. They believe that it was undertaken by a member of staff that has been dismissed. And so this has been reported on in the media, and the Telegraph and the Guardian and the Times, and other sort of British newspapers. And so it's a very fast-moving story. Here's one of the journalists, Tom Seymour, who reported on this thief. And so they're taking, this individual stole jewelry and gems dating back several thousand years from the collection at the British Museum and sold it on eBay. And interestingly enough, I find this kind of silly almost. Their PayPal account on eBay then linked to their Twitter profile potentially, and that might be how the person was caught. The alleged individual was caught. People have been following this on Twitter and the reporting, and there's some very impressive sleuthing. You can see this is one of the gems that was stolen and sold on eBay in 2016 for a total of £40, which is really interesting because the people estimate that the worth of these is in the millions of pounds. Any thoughts on why this is being sold for such a low value, just £40 for such a priceless artifact?
I love the word priceless, but we can talk about that later.
That's a good one.
I, on the one hand, there's just the fact that it has been stolen. The fact that you can, like, when you go to the big art fairs like TEFAB in Maastricht or the Basel Art Fair or the in London, like the big fancy ones, like they will sell you antiquities for hundreds of thousands of euros or pounds or dollars or whatever you like. And sometimes they don't even have a price tag, because if you need to ask the price, you can put this. But these things are antiquities by and large that have a halfway decent provenance. If you just want to sell something, and especially a small piece that doesn't have any kind of documentation, which it doesn't if you've just stolen it yourself, you can't really ask for a high price. It would draw too much attention. And on the other hand, though, it's just not worth that much because you don't really know what it is.
So provenance is the history of the ownership of an artifact, and that really matters because of the legal framework around buying and selling of antiquities, particularly this UNESCO convention. Tell me if I'm wrong on any of this. And
you're not wrong, but I think the dictionary site is a tad inaccurate as of the way that antiquities crime researchers talk about this thing. So the second one that's on here, a record of ownership of a work of art or an antique used as a guide to authenticity and quality. That's right, like a provenance. That's basically the provenance history of the work. For the place or origin, or for us archaeologists, the find spot, essentially, we would use the term provenance.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Which is especially funny because in German, both of these things are translated by provenience, and that just, yeah.
People mix up provenance and provenience all the time. And so another key thing, though, is the legality of buying and selling antiquities. Is because of this UNESCO convention, you need to demonstrate that it was exported from the country of origin prior to 1970. That's why having a provenance is so important, to demonstrate that you have the right to buy and sell this object. To me, that was what I was thinking is maybe why the prices were so low, is so you can't really trace the object back to the British Museum, because it's so obviously illicit. If you're on eBay, you just sell it for a huge discount in a sense.
Also, and that's the point also, in a way, the point that I wanted to make about the word priceless. The prices for art and antiquities, they're just vibes. Something is worth what somebody says it's worth. For us as archaeologists, we can look at a clay pot and say this is the most important find ever, but somebody else just sees a cracked pot. Sure, there is aesthetic values, there is artistic value, there are precious gemstones and gold and whatnot, which has a fixed price in a way, but then still not really tied to anything real.
And stolen goods are worthless.
That gives you, in the way, if you're dealing with illegal stuff that is worth millions, you can go to jail for, or to prison for, a much longer time than if you're just selling trinkets that aren't worth much.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think about it, stolen stuff is kind of worthless. You can't sell it for such eye-popping sums if it can be traced back to, its original owner, right? Which it seems like this alleged curator who potentially stole this stuff chose things that had not been photographed at first, but I guess I saw some reporting that some of the later things that was being sold were things that had clear catalog entries and things like that in the British Museum.
It's a bit silly because you can literally look at any item in the British Museum on their website for free. Yeah. Everyone can do that. Everyone can ask for high quality photos.
Yeah,
It's
I have some images from their
wonderful.
website to show later on. Yeah, exactly. And then another thing I found interesting about the announcement was the director of the British Museum saying this is a highly unusual incident. Just doing some quick reading around on kind of museum and library theft, I found this article by Aaron Thompson, The Old White Mail List of Crimes, talking about theft from kind of archives and libraries. And while we sort of picture a Mission Impossible type setting, somebody breaking into a museum, to be honest, most of the real damaging crimes are done by insiders that have this access and this privilege to get into storerooms and things like that. And Aaron documents it with the alleged theft from the Egypt Exploration Society, supposedly by Dirk Obink, and then another example from the Mariners Museum where the person in charge of the storage instituted new settings for security reasons, but then and it seemed like this person was the one that ended up stealing things. And so I think we need to reframe our picture of who commits antiquities crimes, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
One of the questions I oftentimes get asked as an archaeologist, and it always shocks me every time I hear it, is, have you ever thought of just putting something in your pocket and taking it? And it's sort of like, look, this is our responsibility. Our job is to treat archaeological artifacts in context with respect. And so people in my field, my colleagues, anybody that would do this, I have nothing but disdain for and contempt and hatred for, because you're making us all look like immoral scabs in a sense for what, 40 pounds per gem.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. Like, why would you do that? Why would
Yeah.
you? I assume there have to be some not necessarily psychological issues, but like maybe it's for the thrill of it, just to see if you can do it.
I have
Completely.
no idea about the
I have no idea. I'm not an expert in criminal psychology. I don't know what would make a person do this, but yeah.
especially when you're dealing with uncatalogued things as a scholar. Like, let's say you dig something up, obviously there's no record of that, so in that sense it's kind of easy. And that's the problem. That's why there's no easy way to secure these things, because there's so much uncatalogued archaeology, and it depends upon the ethics of all of us involved to sort of safeguard this for future generations, for cultural heritage, for the world, in a sense. Yeah, I don't know what kind of psychology somebody would have to do that. I've never met anybody who's stolen stuff, but I have nothing but hatred and contempt, because these people make my life harder as a field archaeologist and as someone who studies material. And
It's just, and there is a lot of media and the looter and the archaeologist. I mean, I'm not going to say I blame Indiana Jones, but there's a bit of a blame going on then, because there is still this mindset that archaeologists dig in the ground to find cool things. We are always trying to work against, and even like as a journalist in the whole archaeological topic, these are mindsets that are so widespread that they are very hard to change.
well, let's not entirely blame Indiana Jones. I want to share a tweet that you just retweeted.
No, not entirely.
No, not entirely. You just retweeted this. I mean, at the least, Indiana Jones said it belongs in a museum. Did he get right that it should be in its country of origin? That's a different story that I think we need to get to in a second. But at least he instilled the idea that this stuff does not belong in private collections, which I think is to some degree a valuable ethic, even if it might not go the full 9 yards.
It's
Yeah.
first step. I like the reply person that said this is art.
Right, let me
Is it? I mean, if they mean the meme, then I'm completely
right
on
over
board
here.
with that. This is one of my favorite memes.
I think you're right. They probably meant the meme, is my guess.
Yeah. That in that case, I'm completely on board. But like, antiquities are sometimes less than art in a way, but they are always also more than art. They're not just
Yeah.
an art object. Like in a painting, like a Picasso, fantastic, has been made by an artist, and not to diminish that, by an artist, obviously on some way express something too, but like also to just sell. Antiquities are not necessarily made by people just to sell, and especially not the people that made them didn't make them for some dude somewhere somehow selling it for their own gain. These in art are often like lumped in together as also as prime categories, and there are some important differences.
I completely agree. Most artifacts I have excavated, I would not count as art. I study animal bones, so that's trash. And then there's, of course, lots of utilitarian objects, and then there's religious artifacts or ritual artifacts and grave goods, things like that. That's not art in the way that we think.
Yeah, but see that is
in a museum.
Especially your field of expertise is one of those most affected by this. But like, imagine somebody, a looter or somebody digs up a big old pot full of sheep bones. You could potentially, if you had the access to it, find out what kind of food relation the people living there had to what if maybe even have a recipe at some point. This would be cool. This would be interesting. This is the thing that interests us as historians, I would say. But somebody who just wants to sell it for the market, and even the person that just buys it, they just see, oh, it's a cool pot.
I mean, this is why I am very
throw out the sheep bones.
Yeah, I am very firmly against looting and amateur excavation, even metal detecting, things like that, because that destroys. I'm talking me, because I study animal bones, I study archaeological context, and the retrieval of items just for market value, it destroys everything else that's not for market value but has scientific value.
Especially in times of conflict, when the public order breaks down, these things are even more severe, and as we've seen in Iraq after 2003, sites are just completely ransacked. But it also even happens in peacetime. It's wherever there's no control and poverty and so on going on, and that destroys so much. And it destroys not just for the scientists that want to know these things, it also destroys the site, the descendants that live there that might have the chance to learn something about their ancestors, or who might otherwise get the chance to earn some money through tourism and so on. But all that then is just destroyed. And and that exacerbates this social inequality that already exists already.
Yeah, exactly. So let's move on to some of these tricky questions that you've published on. You've written an article, "Do you expect us to throw it all away?" And I found this chapter to be quite interesting because it's at the ethics involved in how scholars, whether inadvertently or advertently, can participate in this antiquities trade, not by robbing the British Museum and posting stuff on eBay, but simply by studying and publishing on objects that are on the antiquities market. And so I was wondering if you could sort of explain that debate that exists within the field on this topic.
Okay, I'm trying to be as brief as possible, but so what I'm concentrating on this is cuneiform tablets from southern Iraq. Cuneiform is the writing system of ancient Iraq, ancient what some people call Mesopotamia. Especially in the plains of southern Iraq, there are tons of sites, so-called tells. Well, the land is flat, and because the people built with clay, those mounds would rise up. And you can see if there's a mound that rises up, this is not a natural mound. This is an ancient settlement. People know that, and so it was easy to find all those places. Not all those settlements have been scientifically excavated yet, because there are just so many of them. So especially when in 1991 the international sanctions against Iraq kicked in, so the people became gradually poorer and looting went up. And then with the invasion of the American-led coalition in 2003, essentially all hell broke loose, and
technical term,
many of those places were just completely ransacked and looted and riddled with looting holes. Both the very famous ones, some of the very famous ones, some of the famous ones, to be fair, had been protected in a way by specifically the local populace, because yes, some of the local people had enough pride to, or had the opportunity basically, and the cohesion to fight off the looters. In other places, just people came in from the outside and killed the side guards, and or the locals just fled because they weren't feeling safe, or the locals participated in looting because it was the only way to feed their families. All of those things happened in different places, and both the scientifically excavated places and the as yet unknown places were looted. And as it so happens, there were a lot of cuneiform clay tablets. Now, this is a bit of a special streak in cuneiform studies, is the Ur-3 period studies. Essentially, this was one of the first territorial states that was a little bit more than just one city. And the people in these different cities that are all part of that Ur-3 kind of empire-y thing, they wrote everything down. They kept receipts for everything, which is cool. It's a bit boring if you have one text. It's great if you have 1,000 texts, and there is a streak of cuneiform scholars who do nothing in their life but just read those texts from those places. So imagine you come up on a whole archive full of texts from one of these places, and you do not know where it's from a city you've never heard of. It's post 2003, so you know that the reason why you've never heard of it is because it hasn't been scientifically excavated and it's been looted. There is no way this could be anything else. The person who sells it to you will tell you, oh yeah, this archive has been in the collection of my grandfather for 100 years, wink wink. Nobody in the field is, I'm sorry, dumb enough to think that is any truth to that. So, you know, everyone knows that these places are destroyed. If I had published this in a cuneiform journal and not in a book for basically art crime researchers, I would have called this Lamentation for Irisagrig, because Irisagrig is the lost city, these places, these tablets from one of those. So there are others. There is the Darshana archive, which is also one of those places. We know that this one has been destroyed. We know that we will never recover the archaeological context of these things.
So we don't know where exactly in Iraq this archive is from, but it's a well-known archive. Okay.
Actually, somebody has published, and this was a cuneiform scholar who has published a very good theory on where it could be, because yes, it has been actually mentioned in the records of another city where they say this is 2 days by boat down the canal, whatever. So generally in ancient Sumer, the people would travel by boat. It's always said they invented the wheel. I'm sure they did, but they would rather go by boat because they had a lot of canals, and so they were going by waterways. So they have a bit of an idea how much 2 days way down that canal would be. And they also know that there is a couple of undiscovered sites or unsurveyed sites that have been heavily looted. So basically this person publishes this article saying, yep, it's probably that, because we know these texts have been looted and this place has been looted. This is all with like remote satellite imaging, because of course you wouldn't go there because there's a war on.
So explain better the ethical issue of studying this material. How does studying it actually support the antiquities market and looting?
On the one hand, and always we are talking of very famous men, not just men, but almost just men in this field. These are people who have professorships, who have tenure, who have a name in the field, who have published tons and tons of books and articles, and are generally seen and respected as experts in this specific field. And they lend some of that good name to the collectors, because these archives or these texts are in the hands of a private collector.
I guess my question more is not about who the people are that are doing this just yet, but more like, what does this gain for a private collector if an academic publishes?
Yeah, the thing is that for once, you have not just, this is a clay tablet with some strange squiggly things on it. This is a text about the weavers of the temple of someone, and there is an interesting article about the kennel masters of the dogs of the goddess Gula, and so on. As I said, one of these texts is boring as hell, but like 20 or 100 of these texts are actually quite insightful. You can say, so I am the one who owns the texts that have led to this interesting bit of knowledge. For the cuneiformists, on the other hand, there's the prestige to say, oh, I found out this interesting thing. But then they kind of have to write in their preface to their book things like, I am very thankful to the generous owner of who gave me access to. While the owner, on the other hand, has the social and cultural capital and can say, like, I am the person who.
So in a sense, an artifact that's been published by a scholar, it's been authenticated, and it's more valuable because it's been published.
And on the other hand, the middlemen in the trade, or the looters, so to speak, know, oh, right. So people want these little things, and they're small, they're easily portable. You make a hole, you find those, you take them out, destroy the archaeological context, but that's not what those people care for. And you get money for them. You get, in the context of war, as it was with many of those things that went after 2003, that's great, because a handful of dollars literally can save your life or buy your child medicine that you can't get in any other way at this point. Okay, fine. People just would search for cuneiform tablets specifically because they know that those bring money, as opposed to other types of artifacts that aren't inscribed. But if it's just, I don't know, a figurine or whatnot, then as with these things from the British Museum, they're cool, but you can't sell them for that much money because the scientific value is not. This is not the case with the cuneiform tablets, because those people who want to study them say the scientific value is great, I want to study that. And as long as that happens, will not stop the destruction of sites in order to find specifically inscribed objects.
So scholars that study potentially looted stuff are helping increase the demand for looted artifacts. Yeah, and this is why I, for one, will never show any private collections on this YouTube channel, nor will I ever publish on them or anything like that for these sorts of reasons. I see scholars that study material without provenance as just a shade, but not many shades different from one who's actually stealing from a museum. But yeah, it's a flip side of the same coin on the same market that is very shady.
Yeah, but on the other, I sorry that I keep going on about this, but there is another thing, there's another shade, this dilemma, because I've been talking about the big tenure track professors there. But obviously, the whole field of cuneiform studies also has a lot of young students, like I was at some point in my life, that for one, they do not really, what I did not really get any primer on this ethical. I did not get a choice. There was not saying, like, if you do not feel comfortable with dealing with looted material, if you have ethical problems with this, don't do it. No, I never got this choice. I never had the idea that I could have ethical problems with it. And I started my studies in 2005. So after that particular horse had left the barn
I learned a
already.
lot about this stuff from Professor Brian Rose at the Penn Museum when I was an undergraduate. He was president of the Archaeological Institute of America at the time, and he would give talks for the U.S. Army even, informing them about looting. And he would do this for all the students as well, explaining these kind of ethical issues and these dilemmas and teaching us about the UNESCO agreement. And he told us this story when he was excavating at Troy, where they came upon, I think it was a statue of Hadrian. I could be wrong on who the statue was, but they had to leave it in the trench and somebody had to stay overnight because they were worried about looters. So he slept overnight in the trench to make sure that there'd be no looting that goes on, because looting is a very serious issue in the field. As I've said, I've dealt with them and things like that. Something that I think that's why I wanted to interview you, was to share these kind of ethical issues with a sort of larger audience. And let's think about some other ethical issues that this heist brings up. One of the groups of artifacts that was impacted by this heist are these gems collected by Charles Townley in the 18th century.
I love this one.
This is one of my favorites. Yeah.
A cricket on a chariot drawn by two flies or
two other insects. Yeah, maybe butterflies. I'm not sure. Cricket on a chariot. And I don't know if this one was stolen. I took the images from the British Museum collection website looking for examples of Townley gems, but I've not seen anything on which specific Townley gems have been pilfered. I would hope that some of these that are better documented are not stolen, but I don't know. This one's also interesting, an elephant coming out of a shell.
That's just amazing.
Yeah.
I see why you would want to have them. If they were on eBay and I would think they're not stolen, I would be tempted.
If they were modern, created by an artist and sold on Etsy, I'd be totally down. If there's any Etsy artists watching, let's create some of these things. And they're pretty elaborate, these Townley gems. And this collector, Charles Townley, is from the 18th, early 19th century. He did these tours, grand tours through Italy, and he collected series of gems, series of marble sculptures. This is a drawing of his marble sculpture collection. They're called the Townley marbles. And in fact, the British Museum has some really cool, I meant to grab one and I didn't, some really cool 3D models of some of them that I've used while teaching to try to give students some different perspectives of how to view these. Here's one of them that's Discobolus. Of course, these were collected so long ago. This one, if I remember, is from Hadrian's Villa, but it's the wrong head, because back then they put together pieces of sculpture that just didn't really go together. That's very common. But I wanted to bring this up because this comes from a different era of collecting. And these were, in a sense, legal, but the quality of excavation and the recording, it's not much different from what you have with this taking of the Parthenon marbles by Lord Elgin, which is just a decade or so after Townley passes away. I have this drawing of the Parthenon from like around 1765, made, it's held in the British Museum. And I bring it up because the British Museum was in the news about a year ago talking about how most of the Parthenon marbles were taken from the rubble. And so the British Museum has been protecting them in many ways. But this drawing shows that that statement is quite misleading, because here's one of the Parthenon marbles from the pediment, and you can see it was still in place in 1765. And so I was thinking, you know, what about the context of these kind of more early collections, these Townley pieces and things like that? What's our ethical responsibility as scholars? How do you see this in comparison to kind of these unprovenance modern things that are what we would call looted, right? I wondered what your take was.
I mean, on the one hand, it's they're slightly, and especially in a criminological and in the legal sense, they're quite different. But in an ethical sense, I would say, I mean, there is a lot of irony of stealing Greek antiquities from the British Museum. Like when I told a Greek friend about this, he laughed. So yeah, it's a bit like calling the police on the guy who stole your Coke. So, I mean, on the other hand, to be a little more serious about this, I think there is a deep-seated feeling of superiority in the Western Museum, and we laugh about the British Museum, but German museums, the Louvre, or the Metropolitan Museum also big in the news lately, or
Wait,
or
let's just laugh.
American museums aren't better.
Let's laugh at this really quickly. This is one of
I
my
mean,
favorites.
can we just say white people, because this is where the white people live, that for some reason seem to think that they can own the rest of the world, and us basically, in a way, like here in these countries like Germany, like the UK, like the US, like anywhere in Europe or even Australia, where these things then end up, both those that have been recently looted, and because there is already this foundation of museums, of a sheen of high culture, when you have these ancient things, these culturally important things from maybe other cultures. Yeah, there is, on the one hand, there is a significant power imbalance simply out of socioeconomic reasons, and because of the transnational networks that have been carried over since colonial times, and there are still mindsets that are very colonial, especially if you're working with in Western Asia, in Iraq, Syria, or what is also called the Middle East. When people speak about this, oh, there's constantly war there. Like, mate, we're living in Europe. There is constantly war here as well. There's been 2 civil wars in the 1990s in Europe, if you haven't paid attention. So yeah, there's not overall more war somewhere else than here. And do not have a superior ability to keep antiquities. We do seem to think that, and I think this is just carried over from those 19th century colonial times, where this idea of the white man bringing Christianity into the world, and high culture, and I don't know, taking some other nice stuff back.
I think that was the irony so much of this event, was that, the British Museum has argued for so long that it can protect things like the Parthenon marbles and other antiquities better than their countries of origin. And it shows that there's theft going on here. There are leaks. I've seen reports on leaks in the rooms where, for example, the Parthenon marbles are, or the lines from Assyria are. I know we were talking about it earlier as well. The problem is they claim that it's free to go to the British Museum and access all these antiquities from all over the world, but it's only free if you're in London, after all. You have to get to London and stay in London and be able to afford that and have the visa to get there and all these kind of things. There's this kind of issue as well, that yes, it's free, but only if you can get there physically in person.
It's much easier to get Iraqi antiquities into the UK than to get Iraqi citizens into the UK. We learned that with a colleague that we actually invited at the University of Glasgow as a project colleague, who was supposed to come over for 2 weeks of working with us in Glasgow, and he wouldn't get a visa to come to the UK, with the given reason that, well, we don't know if he will ever leave. It's like that. In comparison to all the antiquities that are here, it's already pretty rich. But then on the other hand, this was a guy who had a pregnant wife at home and had absolutely no reason to stay in the UK. He just wanted to come over to work here and then go back home and go on with his job and his life. There's this arrogance that keeps out the people, but wants to keep in the culture. It's extremely enraging.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that that's what this heist brings to mind, at least for me, is all these kind of issues, the role of us as scholars and what it means to study this material, the ethical responsibility we have to it, not just to the artifacts, but to living people today, to try to make it accessible and to work and collaborate.
It has to be kept in mind in this. I don't know.
Thank you so much, Luise. I really appreciate it. And it was great to talk to you.
I'm very happy.
Yeah.
I'm very happy to be invited.